although the so-called Red Scare has been the main focus for most of the historians of that period of history, or that period of time, there was a concurrent Lavender Scare, resulting in investigation of suspected homosexuals. This lesser-known element of McCarthy's probe probably harmed more people than those blacklisted for being communists or communist sympathizers. Senator McCarthy inspired similar action in state legislatures across the United States. And in 1954, I was a senior at Vanderbilt University, where Tennessee's version of McCarthyism was directed at the Highlander Folk School in Monteagle, Tennessee, eventually outlawed and actually bulldozed by the legislature. And that was where Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King Jr., John L. Lewis, all had gone for training. Once the institution was demolished, it shifted to Dorchester Academy in Georgia. But again, Tennessee and Florida were not unique. Other states were doing similar things. And Florida's version was called the Johns Committee, named for Senator Charlie Johns, nearby Stark. Johns chaired the state Senate's investigative body, which set out to prove that the civil rights movement was a communist conspiracy. Failing to find such a conspiracy, the committee turns its attention to the rooting out of homosexuality at UF, FSU, and what was then the new USF in Tampa. When I accepted a teaching position at UF, the law school, in March of 1962, I knew nothing of the Johns Committee. I certainly knew about McCarthyism, but not Florida's version. But a twist of fate led me to soon learn about the Johns Committee. At a Friday afternoon social gathering at the Yale Law School in late March of 1962, I was introduced to a tall, thin man. He introduced himself, actually, as being P.K. Young, and said he had heard I had just been hired by UF. He also said that he had taught at UF Law School until recently, and I asked him where he was now, or at that time then, and he said he had moved to the Brooklyn Law School as a member of that faculty. That surprised me a little. Perhaps it's snobbishness, but I thought Brooklyn Law School was a step down in the academic world. But when I arrived at UF in the fall of 1962 to begin teaching, I mentioned to our associate dean, some of you may remember, Lynn Powers, that I had recently met a faculty member named P.K. Young, and I then learned the true story of what had happened and why he moved to the Brooklyn Law School. He was effectively an exile. He was a victim of Florida's Johns Committee. Because of his family prominence in Florida history and UF history, he, unlike many other victims, was permitted to quietly resign and leave the state. He died in New York City in 1984 at age 67. His obituary does not even name his parents. When I recently began researching what had happened to him, Jim Cusick found no trace of him in UF's P.K. Young history, or the P.K. Young Library of Florida History. For the next 30 years at UF, I never heard the Johns Committee mentioned, and certainly not its victims. Eventually 15 faculty members, one of whom attempted suicide, and dozens of expelled students. This began to change in 1992 after the Florida Supreme Court ruled that the legislature and its documents were subject to Florida's Sunshine Law, which was drafted by a Gainesville legislator, J. Emory, nicknamed Red Cross. Although the Florida Senate finally became so embarrassed by the Johns Committee and its iconic purple pamphlet, which was deemed by many to be pornography, that the Senate refused to continue the committee's existence. But again, the Senate sealed the 50,000 pages of the committee's documents. Well, again, the Florida Supreme Court decision in 1992 unsealed them, letting the sunshine in and exposing one of the darkest chapters of Florida history, arguably second only to Florida's love affair with lynching. Now I want to show a recent documentary filmed at the University of Central Florida. And following the documentary, we will hear from Carl Van Ness. And Carl is the Florida Political Papers archivist in the Department of Special and Area Studies collections in the George A. Smathers libraries. He's been with the library since 1984, and Carl has served as the university's official historian since 2006, and had previously served as the university archivist from 1997 to 2003, in addition to writing and lecturing about the university's history. In fact, Carl gives walking tours of the historic campus when the weather and COVID permit. So I'm sure that when Carl has spoken about the committee and what's in the UF archives, some of you will have questions, and Carl will try to answer those based on what's available in the UF archives. So this film is about 24 minutes long. It's one of several documentaries that have been done in recent years. I chose it in part because it features in several segments our own ILR and OCAMIC resident, Senator Bob Graham. I think all the documentaries are excellent, and you may want to watch others on your own. But with this, Julianne, let's watch the committee.
The following program is brought to you by the University of Central Florida College of Arts and Humanities, the Office of the President, the Office of Undergraduate Research, by Kroll, a division of Duff and Phelps, and by Susan L. Gallagher. A complete list of funders is available at aptonline.org and thecommitteedocumentary.org.
They were calling in students as well as faculty and staff and harassing them.
They questioned me for 15, 16, 17 hours. I was there all night till the next day.
I was terrified when they called me in there. I just didn't know what to expect. I denied everything, and that was the end of it.
So I was afraid of everything, who I talked to, what happened. So I ended up not going to classes. I thought everybody was watching me.
One communist on the faculty of one university is one communist too many.
This sort of began to sort of merge very well into this whole notion in another political discourse about communism. The idea is that there was this hidden communist conspiracy in the United States. And so it was very easy then to see, to sort of equate homosexuality with communism and homosexuals with communists. There being sort of subversive elements hidden in American society.
There was no evidence to connect homosexuality and communism, but in the Cold War climate, that is what people did, and it sold to people, and it was used to push a certain kind of political agenda. And these were not unusual in the Cold War. They were not unusual after the Brown decisions. A lot of states were forming these kinds of committees.
Charlie Johns, he became focused on the question of whether within the state university system there were communists and homosexuals. He would call people to testify and ask very difficult and frequently inappropriate and embarrassing questions.
The Johns Committee was formed in 1956. Its full title was the Florida Legislative Investigation Committee, and it formed in response to the Brown v. Board of Education Supreme Court decisions in 54 and 55. And their initial target was the civil rights activists, the NAACP, who were pushing for desegregation in Florida.
So in a public hearing, members of the NAACP were asked if they knew of any communists, or if there were any communists in their organization, because the committee was trying to discredit the NAACP by making them appear communist influenced.
It's my understanding, and this is purely hearsay, that this organization is attempting to organize on the University of Florida campus. And the Un-American Activities Committee has said that there's a number of known communists that belong to this organization.
Well, the NAACP was very organized. They had a great organizational structure, and they were able to mire the committee down in court cases from 57 and 1958.
So the committee realized that they were going to have to shift their focus and find easier targets. Otherwise, they were not going to be renewed or refunded by the legislature. Gays and lesbians, of course, would not have a national organization behind them like the NAACP.
This is paralleling something else going on in the national climate. The 1950s were probably the most intense time of oppression for gay and lesbian people in the United States. And a number of local areas started to run raids and sting operations and so forth to entrap citizens.
There was certain restrooms that were popular, if you will. And then you have to go in there and catch them doing the act. It was all really unpleasant. Yeah, I interviewed a lot of people. What were you doing in that restroom? Why were you in there? So-and-so told us that they had a homosexual relationship with you. Is that true? Not, yes, no, that sort of thing.
When they began to arrest people, they found that they were arresting teachers, and they discovered that a number of the teachers had gone to the University of Florida.
R.J. Strickland was the chief investigator for the Johns Committee. He was in the Tallahassee Police Department and had worked investigating the Tallahassee bus boycott.
One of the tactics that Strickland pretty much always used was to start trying to get information from people, and usually they would hesitate in various kinds of ways.
He could be pretty ruthless. He would interrogate people late at night, all that kind of stuff. He would lie to people and say that, they had been named by someone else when they actually hadn't. They also didn't mind interrogating students in motel rooms and pressured them to give information about other students that might be gay or lesbian, or about professors who might be gay or lesbian.
The Tallahassee Police Department is using Florida State University students as informers against homosexuals. The students get $10 a head every time one is approached by a suspected sex offender. Police Chief Frank Stoudemire feels that the students want to work as informers. It's all right with him. John Hayes, Channel 4 News, Tallahassee.
It's very interesting when you look back. Everyone talks about a coming out story, and I said I never was in, so I couldn't come out. I had little girlfriends from the time I was an adolescent, but you kind of had to play the game, and even in high school you knew that, so you had to have a boyfriend.
being gay was not a decision. It was just something that I've never felt any other way. It's like, to me, it's completely natural. I mean, the idea of gay rights wasn't even on the radar back then. They were unthinkable back in 1960. Early on, I was just focused on being a student and trying to get through the challenges of being at a large university by myself. It was a challenge just to focus on my studies. I was on the swimming team. I swam for the University of Florida. I was always interested in photography, too.
I wanted to be a band director. My band director and his wife suggested FSU. I loved FSU until my sophomore year when all of the stuff happened to me then. I was, by that time, of course, in marching chiefs and really having a great time. I was just being a student, active in music, played intramural sports. I think that's where they found me, because a lot of the girls that played intramurals were lesbians, and so I think that's why I was targeted. They took me into the basement of the administration building and to a room, and I was there for at least 15 hours. I think it was probably closer to 17 because it was the next day. During that time, I was not offered the opportunity to go to the bathroom, to have anything to eat, or to have anything to drink. All they wanted to know were the names of people. Did you have relationships with other women on the campus? What about this, these people? I said, no. Did you see anybody doing this or that? And they would be pretty graphic in what they said. It was almost like there was a very deliberate attempt to keep me longer and longer and longer, so I'd be more and more tired. And I just kept saying no because I hadn't. If I had, it would have been different. I don't know how I would have reacted, because then it would have been a matter of honesty.
I will never forget that day. I was sitting in my dormitory room on a Tuesday around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and there was a knock on the door. And it was John Tileston. He was an investigator for the University Police Department. And he knocked on my door and said, would you come with me, or not would you, come with me to the University Police Department. And that was the first I knew about it. And they brought me into a room and said, we have information that you're a homosexual. And I said, you do? I said, where'd you get that from? And he declined to tell me where that information came from. I said that, I don't know where you got this information from, but it's not correct. They showed me a letter from the president asking me that they can help me with my problem, so to speak. And I was shocked by that as well, that the university president would be involved in this witch hunt as well. Had I admitted to it, I would have been kicked out of the University of Florida.
So I was afraid of everything, who I talked to, what happened. So I ended up not going to classes, took incompletes, and didn't go back. And so I ended up with an academic probation. I knew what was on the record. They said, you're a lesbian, you can't be a lesbian and come to a state college. I cannot help but imagine that many people, including mainly the people who already had their careers, professors and staff people at the university, that their lives were ruined.
The irony today is that the student union is named after J. Wayne Wright's. I would say he was part and parcel of that Johns committee. The irony is that the student union is named after a homophobe.
Well, my name is John Stanton Tileston, Sr. I started with the University Police Department in April of '56. None of us carried guns in those days at University Police Department. We were just friendly officers. Give me a kiss. You got flies. The Johns Committee wanted me to work with them about finding all the queers and the communists on campus. I thought, well, that's kind of silly. But I'll do that. That's what they want me to do. Criminals, it didn't bother me. But people in this situation, it bothered me. It was pointed out to me that if you took them out of their classroom, it was the benefit of the shock. You know, I felt sorry for people that happened to. For the most part, these people were rather young, very frightened. They had been given misinformation about they were going to be kicked out of the university, and before I got to them, there was some scare tactics involved. It bothered me a great deal to be talking to somebody that's a PhD, and here we are, we've caught this person in a restroom, or somebody has told us they're gay, and you know, and I got him across the desk from me, gonna wreck this man's future, or this woman's future, over this. Not worth it. But you do what you gotta do.
This is serious. You can imagine what it would mean to your mother and father. We would have to go in as police officers and tell them that your son or your daughter is a homosexual.
I was at the University of Florida from 1955 to 1959. The students felt that it was inappropriate and abusive behavior, and it was degrading the value of their own degrees and diplomas. It degraded the national standing of universities in Florida and had a lingering effect which was felt several decades after the Johns Committee went out of business.
With the case of USF, the American Association of University Professors, the American Association of University Women, the national media got involved in telling people this is what's going on, and that was a real turning point, because I think people then were starting to think, well, the Johns Committee overreached by that point.
The Purple Pamphlet is a report by the Johns Committee. Its official name is Homosexuality and Citizenship in Florida. It was an explanation of homosexuality, and it was supposed to be directed towards parents and teachers and how we have to fight this horrible menace and, you know, that sort of thing, the threat of homosexuality and all that.
Well, when it came out, of course, it had the opposite effect. People saw it as obscene, and the fact that it was paid for by taxpayers' money, was considered to be outrageous. In fact, in Dade County, the state's attorney declared it an obscene piece of material, and it couldn't be shown in public or circulated.
That, of course, was a very big mistake they made as well. It was published about a year and a half before they were disbanded, which is like early 1964. Johns himself resigned from the committee.
I remember Anita Bryant. She was the anti-gay campaign in Dade County, and she was the spokesperson at the time for the Florida Citrus Commission.
Orange juice with natural vitamin C from the Florida sunshine tree.
But she was concerned that children, models, gay males, and she felt that that was a very threatening kind of situation. Gay organizations, gay newspapers, gay media across the country basically began to focus on her as sort of the embodiment of all the hateful homophobia that they saw in American society.
And I remember I was so upset about that, I called the Florida Citrus Commission and spoke to Art Darling, his name was. He was the PR guy at the Florida Citrus Commission. And I told him, I said, you know, Art, regardless of what your views are on gay rights, the fact that Anita Bryant is now so closely associated with this anti-gay movement diminishes her effectiveness as a spokesperson for the Florida Citrus Commission, and therefore she should be fired from that position.
all so much for the cards and the gifts, surprising me with pastor appreciation. It feels good to be appreciated, so I thank you so much for that. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I'm so glad you came to save us.
Ruth was in the choir, and I just knew of her. We'd known each other for years before we got together. Funny thing is, she asked me out several times before I said yes.
When Canada approved gay marriage, we happened to be scheduled to go to a conference. So we were married in British Columbia, and legally. So we have a very legal marriage certificate from Canada, which is not recognized.
Legal up to a point. Knowing Ruth now, I just can't imagine someone bullying her like that. Of course, I didn't know her when she was 19 years old, and I can imagine, I guess when I was 19, I didn't know my rights so well either, but no child should be bullied, whether it's by another child or by the teachers or the administration. And I still blame FSU for it, because I believe they knew it was happening. We see discrimination all the time and witch hunts all the time for different reasons, and the more we let it happen, the more it's going to continue to happen for one reason or the other.
I still love FSU. I don't blame the school. I blame the state of Florida that happened. I know they knew what they were doing, and they need to apologize to us. To pay us all back, here's what you need to do. You need to pass gay marriage in Florida. That'd be it. We'd be done. I believe God has a plan, and you get through it no matter what. So the fact that I didn't get to be a band director and do that path, for me, I ultimately ended up in the exact career that I should have had, which I would not have done, quite honestly, at least for a longer period of time, had I been able to go through school and get my degree.
The trend line of America is towards inclusion, not exclusion. The talents of all of our people, whatever their backgrounds, their history, their orientation might be, are important assets for the nation today and in the future.
If you know your history, then you're not alone. You're part of something bigger. You really aren't alone. And you will also find out that people have gone through this before, and they've gone through much worse, and they've survived. You need to find about your people and your history, because it'll make you feel a lot better about yourself, and you have no reason to not feel proud.
Morning, Chuck. Good. How are you? Good to see you. So, it's really, I almost didn't find the address, but saw you out here, so no problem. Here we are 50 years later, and you look back on all the changes that have occurred, and it's really stunning to think how things have changed in the country and in Florida.
In retrospect, thinking back, did you ever think that this day would come like this?
No, it was scary, and there were a lot of people that were faculty members and students and staff. At that time, it was a horrible time in the history of the University of Florida, and we're still trying to live it down, I guess, in some ways.
Well, yeah, it's shameful, if you will. But a lot of progress was made out of it.
Yeah, I survived all of, not only got called in by the Johns Committee, but ended up being a faculty member at the University of Florida for 42 years.
In spite of it.
In spite of it all. So.
Right. Eat your heart out, Charlie.
Yeah.
want to thank all of you for traveling from far and wide to be present at this magical place to affirm and celebrate this bonding of love between Chris and David. Marriage is a commitment to life, to the best that two people can find and bring out in each other. It offers opportunities for sharing and growth that no other relationship can equal. And now, for as much as David and Chris have declared their solemn intention before these witnesses, have exchanged rings as your mutual pledge to one another, by the authority vested in me by the Universal Fellowship of Metropolitan Community Churches and the state of Florida, I am pleased to pronounce you married. You may kiss again. Yay!
I love you guys.
All right.
Love you.
Sunshine State.
You are official.
Thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
Great job, Ruth.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Such an honor to do this for you.
Third time I've watched it, and once again, I'm outraged. I'm outraged that the Florida legislature, 60 years later, has never been able to muster a majority to apologize to those victims. So if you have any influence with the Florida legislature, I hope you would speak up. With that, we were going to ask Carl to talk to us about information available in the archives and anything else he wants to say about this. But I appreciate all of your taking the time to watch this. I think it's very important. Carl?
Thank you, Roy. I hope everyone has recovered from the holidays and from the ordeal of last week. I know I'm still recovering from what happened last week, but I think a lot of what happened is relevant to the discussion we're having today. I'm going to focus my remarks on the general campus environment during the years of the Johns Committee and briefly explore gay and lesbian life at the University of Florida through the few sources that we have. We don't really have a lot. I will also contrast how two different presidents, J. Wayne Wrights at the University of Florida and John Allen at the University of South Florida, handled the attacks on their respective institutions. And the committee, the film you just saw kind of touches on that, but there's a lot more involved. Before I do that, I want to go over some basic numbers about the Johns Committee. The literature on the Johns Committee can be confusing at times, particularly in regard to the number of people affected by the committee. The film states at the end that there were over 200 people that were impacted, that were either lost their job or expelled from a university. That sounds like a suspiciously round number to me. First off, we have no way of knowing how many students were involved. Student records are not accessible due to what is known as FERPA, also known as the Buckley Act. Don't ask me what FERPA stands for, I can never remember. And the only people that can access a student's records are the student himself or herself. So, but even if these records were available, it would be exceedingly difficult to wade through them and make any conclusions as to who might have been victimized by the committee. Also, gay students were not necessarily expelled. Some were sent to the psychiatric department at the infirmary, or perhaps down the hill to Shands, which had opened in 1958, a year before the Johns Committee did its investigations here. I'm going to talk more about that in a few minutes. Faculty and staff, though, is a different story because Wrights actually told somebody in a letter how many people were fired, and the number he gave was 14. We now know, thanks to Roy and his story, that 14 is not completely accurate. There's at least one other person out there who lost his job here, and I suspect that there were others. But clearly there were others who were threatened, and some may have left the university later. We don't have access to staff records, but we do have access to faculty terminations and resignations. And we can tell from those records that 9 faculty, 8 men and 1 woman, were terminated abruptly at the time of the investigation, and we know their names and what departments they worked in. That would mean that the remainder, 5, were not faculty, but were employed by the university in some other capacity. So that's what we know in terms of numbers. But by the way, Wrights also admitted that he destroyed all of the university's records related to the investigations. But as Roy pointed out, the State Archives maintains the official records of the committee, and they are apparently voluminous. I've never actually investigated and never actually looked at those records, but I've talked to a number of researchers over the years who have looked at those records and have told me a lot of the details. Of course, those records are all the names of people that were investigated. Their names are blacked out. In 1959, when the Johns Committee came to Gainesville, student enrollment stood at 12,710. Today, it's around 57,000. If you walked around the campus back in those days, you would be hard-pressed to find a student or a faculty member who was not white. You would have to look even harder for an African-American who was not employed in some service capacity as either a custodian, a groundskeeper, or perhaps in the cafeterias, or as a field laborer in the agricultural units. Under court order, the university began the glacial process of desegregating, first the graduate programs in 1958, and then the undergraduate programs in 1962. And as the film points out, this may have been a motivation for Johns's attack on the University of Florida, because the University of Florida was the first to integrate. In 1959, there were only 3 Black students at the University of Florida. And 10 years later, there's still less than 100 Black students who are enrolled at any given time. So in other words, it's nominal and token integration. Real integration doesn't begin until the 1970s. There would have been a smattering of Asian students on campus, both Asian American and international. And you would have likely encountered an international student from Latin America, especially if you hung around the Center for Latin American Studies. Overall, though, the campus was still very much a Southern campus dominated by white native Floridians. The band played Dixie to open the football games, and the boys of Kappa Alpha waved their Confederate flags while Dixie was being played. However, there are undercurrents of change in 1959, and those undercurrents would become more pronounced in the 1960s. Tens of thousands of people were moving to Florida during this period of time, and they were coming from outside the South, principally from the Northeast and the Midwest. The children of these new residents began to show up at the University of Florida in the late 1950s and would gradually, over the years, displace Southern whites as the dominant student demographic. So by the 1970s, you can safely say that white Southerners are a kind of minority. The student body is still white, but the students are coming from backgrounds that are not reflective of the Old South. These undercurrents of change motivated the Johns Committee. And in many ways, the Johns Committee is a defense of the Old South and Old South values. It was also, as Stacy Brockman points out in a book that she wrote, the beginning of the culture wars, which continue today. And last week's upheaval at the Capitol was simply another flashpoint in that culture war, albeit it's a rather large one, but it's just another flashpoint in that struggle. It's been going on for decades, and it will continue for decades, in my opinion. The president of the University of Florida in 1959 was J. Wayne Wrights, and ironically, Wrights owed his position to Charlie Johns. In 1953, the sudden and unexpected deaths of Governor Dan McCarthy and UF President J. Hillis Miller had a profound impact on the university. In 1953, Florida we didn't have a lieutenant governor, and the president of the Senate served as acting governor until a special election could be held. The Senate president in 1953 was Charlie Johns. The Florida Board of Control, which was the predecessor to the Florida Board of Regents, had moved quickly to hire a new president after the death of Miller, and they chose Philip Davidson, president of the University of Louisville, to succeed Miller. Davidson accepted, and he made plans to move to Florida. But before he could do that, acting Governor Johns discovered that Davidson had been president when Louisville integrated in 1951. And Johns didn't care for that. And but by that time, he couldn't override the Board of Control's decision. It had already been made. But what he did was he simply refused to authorize Davidson's pay warrant. And then Davidson had to withdraw his name, and that kind of left both the University of Florida and the acting president, John Allen, in the lurch. The matter was not resolved until Johns was defeated in the 1955 special election. He was defeated by Leroy Collins. And by the time Collins took office, the Florida Board of Control had decided that another national search for a president was not practical, as Johns had pretty much poisoned the available pool of willing candidates, and the Board of Control opted instead to look for an internal candidate. Oddly, they did not pick Vice President Allen, who would have been a logical choice, but chose Provost for Agriculture J. Wayne Wrights. Provost for Agriculture is what we would today call the Senior Vice President for Agriculture and Natural Resources. Allen, though, went on to become the first president of the University of South Florida. And I'm going to circle back to President Allen in a few minutes. Gays and lesbians at the university lived in a world of secrecy and denial. For them, the act of sex was a crime. Although there was a movement to decriminalize gay sex that began in 1955, it is not until Lawrence versus Texas in 2003 that all such laws were deemed unconstitutional by the United States Supreme Court. And as we saw in the film, this is a period of heightened activity against gays and lesbians in the United States. So, you know, on the one hand, you've got some states who are working to decriminalize gay sex, and other states you see even more persecution of gays and lesbians. Same-sex attraction was also considered to be a mental disorder and was commonly treated by psychiatrists. And we see evidence of that in the archives in the University of Florida's monthly infirmary reports, where sexual deviancy is listed among the diagnoses in the psychiatric department. So under the concept of in loco parentis, students under the age of 21, they were still minors, and accordingly, the university often handled cases involving underage students differently than they would with adult students. So a gay student might be referred to the infirmary for treatment, or they might be expelled. You never knew. It was kind of arbitrary. And I'm going to read an excerpt from Rita Mae Brown's semi-autobiographical novel, Ruby Fruit Jungle, which is one of the first coming-of-age lesbian novels. And it gives us an idea of how things might have transpired. Before I read it, though, let me explain the background. Rita Mae Brown entered the University of Florida in 1962, so it's in the same time frame as the Johns Committee. And in 1964, Rita Mae left the University of Florida under clouds of suspicion about her sexuality. In the novel, though, she refers to herself as Molly Bolt. And in the novel, she and her dorm roommate, Faye, out themselves. And Molly is brought before the Dean of Women, who in the book is called Dean Marn. This creature, referring to Dean Marn, was a heifer-like red-haired woman who had been a major in the Army Corps back in World War II. She liked to quote her military experiences as proof that women could make it. I walked into her house and garden office with all the painted plaques on the wall. She had probably had one up there as proof of her femininity. She smiled broadly and shook my hand vigorously. Now tell me about this difficulty you have in relating to girls and your roommate. Dean Marn, I don't have any problems relating to girls, and I'm in love with my roommate. She makes me happy. Her scraggly red eyebrows with a brown pencil glaring through shot up. Is this relationship with Faye Rader of an intimate nature? We have sex, if that's what you're after. I think her womb collapsed after that one. Sputtering, she pressed forward. Don't you find that somewhat of an aberration? Doesn't this disturb you, my dear? After all, it's not normal. I know it's not normal for people in this world to be happy, but I'm happy. Haven't you ever thought about children, Molly? No. This time she couldn't hide her shock. I see. Well, dear, I have arranged for you to see one of our psychiatrists here 3 times a week. And of course, you'll see me once a week. I want you to know that I'm rooting for you to get through this phase you're in. I want you to know I'm your friend. Dean Marn, why are you pushing me so hard to be a mother and all that rot when you aren't even married? She squirmed in her seat and avoided my gaze. I had broken the code and put her on the spot. We're here to discuss you, not me. I had plenty of opportunities. I decided a career was more important to me than being a homemaker. Many ambitious women were forced into that choice in my day. You know what I think? I think you're as much a lesbian as I am. You're a GD effing, I'm doing some self-censoring here. You're a GD effing closet fairy, that's what you are. I know you've been living with Miss Stiles of the English department for the last 15. You're running this whole number on me to make yourself look good. Hell, at least I'm honest about what I am. Young lady, you're going directly to the psychiatrist. You are obviously a hostile, destructive personality and need supervision. What a way to talk to me when I'm trying to help you. You're further gone than I thought. So is any of this true? Well, first of all, the scene did not actually take place. The actual account in Brown's memoir is far less dramatic. There's no encounter with the Dean of Women. The actual Dean of Women was Marna Brady, and she had been a major in the Marine Corps, not the Army, and she commanded an all-female transportation unit in the District of Columbia during the war. Was she living with a woman in 1964? Yes, she was. Was it a same-sex relationship? Almost certainly. And given the fact that Brown writes about this 9 years afterwards, it must have been common knowledge when Rita Mae was here, which opens an interesting question about the Johns Committee. How is it possible that Rita Mae Brown knew the Dean of Women was a lesbian, but not the Johns Committee? And who else did they miss? Well, you might be interested to learn that we have 2 buildings named after gay professors of that time. Dower Hall, named after Distinguished Service Professor Manning Dower, and Carleton Auditorium, named after William Wild Bill Carleton. Carleton's American Institutions class was incredibly popular. I imagine some of the people participating today may have taken classes with Carleton. He was often referred to as the University of Florida's Mr. Chips. There were others too that escaped the Johns dragnet. Typically, but not always, the faculty and staff caught by the Johns Committee were those who were living double lives. Roy had mentioned Sig Dietrich. He was the head of the geography department. He was married with two children. And as Roy pointed out, after he's called before the Johns Committee and told he's being fired, he attempted suicide. Brady, on the other hand, was not leading a double life. She was in a stable relationship with another woman. And while people might make insinuations about her, or Wild Bill Carleton for that matter, and by the way, there were a lot of insinuations about Carleton over the years, those were just insinuations. The experiences of Chuck Wood that you saw in the film and Art Copplestone, who appears in another documentary, shows that gays who were simply accused of being gay without actual proof could stonewall the investigators. You heard about Chuck Wood, how he's being interrogated. He actually turns it on the interrogators and says, oh, people are making accusations about me. Who are these people? Art Copplestone was hauled before the Johns Committee at least 3 times, but he never cracked, and eventually, and both Wood and Copplestone stayed on as students here. Interestingly, the actual psychiatrist at the infirmary was Henry Schumacher. And this is the person that Rita Mae Brown would have gone to if she had been sent to the psychiatrist. And he was no fan of the Johns Committee. In fact, he went public with his dislike of the committee and the stance taken by President Rice. I'm going to read briefly from an article that appeared in the St. Pete Times, dated February 26, 1960. And it says, the headline is, Psychiatrist Wraps University of Florida Probe Method. Dr. Henry C. Schumacher rapped the administration for its use of plainclothes detectives in the investigations and said that the issue of homosexuality had been played up out of all proportion with real problems of the university that were being overlooked. Quote, other problems such as alcohol and heterosexual behavior of students need investigating more than the homosexuals, he stated. Schumacher said that he had not been consulted concerning the latest morals investigations in which a very few individuals were dismissed from the university. And he did not know that they were going on. He noted the harm situations such as this could do to the university. It might deter competent people from choosing to work here, he said. The danger lies in the fact that some of those accused would rather leave than fight the charge of homosexuality. Not 1 in 100 would take it to court, he declared. By the way, Schumacher's wife was also a psychiatrist, and she worked in the psych unit of Shands. And I imagine that both of them saw students. So the film that you saw does a really good job of detailing the events of the University of Florida. And it also does a good job of exploring the committee's impact on its victims. And if you'd like to know more about what happened, I've included several sources in the chat. And I realize it didn't come out very clearly. I'm going to send that as an email attachment as well. If you want something brief, I would suggest an article entitled Pork Choppers, Presidents, and Perverts, the response of 2 university presidents to attacks on the privacy and academic freedom of professors by the Florida Legislative Investigation Committee. However, the article is very brief and it doesn't have the emotional impact of the film or some of the other sources that I'm citing. It does, however, make a good comparison of how President Rice and President Allen at the University of South Florida responded, and there was a world of difference. President Rice collaborated with the committee. As you saw in the film, he offers someone from the University Police Department to assist. He also shared the same values as Charlie Johns, and he had a very extreme distaste for gays and lesbians, and that came out much later in life. In fact, he made certain comments later in life regarding gays and lesbians. President Allen, on the other hand, responded in a different way. Now, President Allen had several years to see what happened at the University of Florida, and he had time to prepare. But he works to defend his faculty and insists that the hearings at the University of South Florida be open. That isn't, in the film they actually point that out, but it's not actually entirely true. Johns agreed to it, and he also agreed not to go public with the report until President Allen could look at it, but he reneged on both. And while some of the hearings were open, he also engaged in the same kind of activity that he did at the University of Florida, and they took faculty members and students to a motel in Tampa to interrogate them. A couple of other good sources that I would recommend. One is Stacy Brockman's Communist and Perverts Under the Palms, the Johns Committee in Florida. Stacy was the one who brought this discussion of the Johns Committee into the larger question and issue of the culture wars. And in some ways, the film that you saw is kind of based on her thesis. She's the one who kind of draws in the connections with the Johns Committee and then later attacks by Anita Bryant on gays and lesbians in Florida. It's an excellent book. Stacy, strangely enough, is not interviewed during the film. Karen Graves is, though. She wrote a book called And They Were Wonderful Teachers, Florida's Purge of Gay and Lesbian Teachers. And that book looks at the impact on K through 12 education, which was just as dramatic and just as horrible as the impact on higher education. I've also provided a link to the other documentary, which was produced at the University of Florida, Behind Closed Doors. It's also excellent and provides more information about what happened at the University of Florida. I'll make a few more points and then I'll open it to questions. It needs to be pointed out that the Johns Committee was not confined to education. There were also investigations at state hospitals and state correctional institutions. The Johns Committee had a very broad and somewhat vague mandate, and they exercised it to the fullest extent. Finally, the committee never ceased its investigations into the civil rights movement. From the very beginning up until the end, they are still trying to connect civil rights with communist subversion. And this never ends. Also, the attacks on gays and lesbians were not simply a response to John's failure to smear the civil rights leaders, but that is a major reason why he kind of shifts the emphasis, as is pointed out in the film. If he doesn't have something to, some results from the committee, then he's going to lose his funding. But it was always his intention to purge gays and lesbians from state institutions. He made that very clear. And even before the committee was funded, there had been several previous attempts to fund a similar committee. And this kind of perversion was a central motivation for his activity. I'm going to stop there and open it up to questions. And perhaps there are some questions in the chat as well.
Carl, that's probably the most interesting talk I've heard on ILR since I came here 4 years ago.
Oh.
I thought that was incredibly illuminating. You shared a lot of information I did not know. And I'm sure there are others who are going to have questions. So as you say, let's open it up.
I have a question. I don't understand how, given this background, the student union was named after Wayne Wright's. Can you, I don't know when it was named.
It was named shortly after the union was open. The original union is now Dower, ironically, the original union it was the Florida Union, which is now Dower Hall. And the Rights Union was opened in 1965. Wright stepped down in 66. And it was thought that that was a logical thing to name the student union after President Wright's. In 1967, this is still not that controversial. I mean, gays and lesbians are still being persecuted in the 1960s. And some of the comments that he made later, they weren't known at the time. But it was the practice through President Kreiser for buildings to be named after university presidents. We no longer do that. In fact, now it's the official policy that we don't. I know President Fox was very glad to hear that was now the official policy, that we will not name buildings after university presidents. But we did through Marshall Kreiser.
Rick, do you have any questions in chat?
We don't. I do have a comment question. Has there been any efforts to develop any lessons learned from the period?
I don't know that the university has. That's a good question. Certainly, the literature, which is rather extensive on the Johns Committee, does draw a lot of lessons, as do these documentaries. I don't know there's ever, you know, as Roy mentioned, there's never been a successful attempt at reconciliation at the state level. I know that, you know, we've acknowledged, you know, what happened at the University of Florida. I know the University of South Florida has also acknowledged what happened there. And there have been apologies at the local level. I don't know there's ever been any kind of systematic review of what happened. And no, I don't, yeah.
Ms. Hurley?
Hi, I was a student back here at the university, 51, 52, and I left. But when I came back, much of this, I can't imagine that it was going on. I don't think students were nearly as aware of what you're talking about. With this, as students were involved in the GI Bill, coming back and going to school, and with a lot of GIs on the campus early 50.
Yeah.
It was a wonderful campus, and student life was wonderful. I worked at the infirmary. I was unaware of people being referred there for sexual ideology, but I don't know what the proper term is really to use anymore about preference. I'm sure is not what we say. It's orientation, or it's hard to know what language to use now. So I don't think that there was awareness by the students. We were into the panty raids and all that kind of stuff. Or you have accounts of students during that time.
Yeah, that's a good point. And there's a really excellent book written, not book, but a manuscript written by Marshall Jones, who was a professor who was fired here in the 1960s. And he does a really good review of the early years of the student movement at the University of Florida. And yeah, there's not, and he contrasts it with that earlier period in the 1950s where there's not a lot of awareness. And then with the civil rights movement, does create a certain amount of awareness and student activity, and that increases through the 60s and 70s. The students that were here at the time were certainly aware in the sense that they were aware of what was going on. In fact, if you look at the yearbook for I think it was 60 or 1961, there's actually a reference to the students who were sadly forced to leave the University of Florida. So they couldn't help but be aware, again, because as was pointed out in the film, you know, these students are being pulled out of classes as a way to intimidate them. So students were very much aware of what was going on. And then as students began to disappear, you know, they became even more aware. But go ahead, sorry.
What is the status of the LGBT student body now? Are there active associations and things are, you know, more even?
Oh, of course. There have been the earliest LGBTQ organization was organized in the 1980s. And there have been organizations since then. And we also have administrators who deal specifically with with gender, with diversity in this regard. So yeah, there's been a lot of changes over the years. And in fact, it was the creation of the first gay and lesbian student organization in the 1980s that prompted President Rice to come back and make these ugly remarks about gays and lesbians, because he was astounded that the student union that bore his name and now had an official office for gays and lesbians. He just didn't see how that was possible, and he said some rather really ugly things. So yeah, there have been a lot of changes over the years, and certainly.
In our session on February 1st, we'll deal specifically with this issue. the University of Florida and LGBTQ issues today.
Good.
John,
Yeah.
John Reiskin, go ahead.
Yeah, I was wondering if the alligator took a position or in reading the old newspaper. Granted, it wasn't the independent alligator at the time, but I was just wondering if they covered any of this.
They certainly covered it. In fact, the article that I read from the St. Pete Times is actually just a copy of an article that appeared in the Alligator. So the Alligator could be at times rather bold. President Rice fired several editors of the Alligator during his tenure. One was David Lawrence, who had the temerity to print an article by I think it was the head of the indelible ACP in Gainesville, and David Lawrence went on to become the publisher of the Miami Herald. But yeah, a number of editors got fired, and of course there were always the problems with the Orange Peel, which was the campus humor magazine, which President Rice deplored, could not stand it, and eventually was succeeded in getting rid of it. But then the students simply went off campus and they published something called the Old Orange Peel in reaction to the university tried to come up with a sanitized version of the Orange Peel called the New Orange Peel. So students went off campus and produced something called the Old Orange Peel. And also there was something called the Charlatan, which was 10 times worse, 100 times worse than anything that was ever in the Orange Peel. So he might have regretted that. But yeah, he had a ongoing battle with editors of the student publications. Yeah, I'm surprised. And also, again, with the yearbook, they acknowledged what was going on. So, yeah.
Okay, we are now 10 minutes over our allotted time.
Oh.
But I feel very strongly about this, which is pretty obvious. And I really appreciate your additional information, Carl, and thank you for being with us, and thank all of you for watching today.
And thank you for inviting me. It was a pleasure.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Stay well. Till next time.
Thank you. On February 25th, we'll be back. We're going to be focusing then on advocacy on LGBTQ issues in the Florida.